Hope everybody's having a good weekend out there. It's Matt, and I'm back with another Rolling Stone album review, doing those in order of release. And so this is one that's kind of like trying to review Sgt. Pepper or something like that. It's hard to think of anything to add that hadn't already been said, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. So usually when, or at least a lot of times when someone is asked for their favorite Rolling Stone album, they almost always pick one of the Big Four, so-called Jimmy Miller produced albums of either Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, or this one, Exile on Main Street. And makes sense because all of those are great albums, so there's no surprise there. But this came out, this is the Rolling Stones' only double album. It came out May the 12th of 1972, which they also had one of their big famous tours that year. Went number one in the US and over in England and a lot of other places too. This is an album that's sort of surprising that it's as good as it is, given the backstory behind it and all the chaos and disarray and confusion, not to mention heavy drug use and other shenanigans that were going on behind the scenes in the making of this album. Some of the songs on here date back to 1969, back when Brian was still alive. So there's a few songs that sort of date from the Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers era. Some of the songs were written new at the time this album was recorded too. There's a lot of songs on here. The band decamped to France, to the south of France, because they were trying to avoid tax payments. And so Keith rented a house called, sure I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but called Nelcot or Nelcote in the south of France. A big mansion of a house that dates back to the Belle Epoque era of France, back in the 1880s, 1890s. Interesting story behind the house in itself. It was originally owned by a rich shipping family. Later on, when the Germans invaded France, they used the house, Nazis used the house for a year or so as sort of a headquarters. And then, of course, Keith comes along and leases it for about 3 years in the early 70s. And now it's owned by some Russian billionaire guy. So pretty interesting background there to that house that's 140 years old. But Keith was actually eventually run out of France because of drug problems and drug arrests, and the French just didn't want him. But so he only lived in the house for about a year, but for some reason he had to pay rent on the house for 2 or 3 years. I guess that was part of his plea bargain or something. Not sure what the deal was behind that, but they made a sort of a makeshift recording studio in the basement of the house, which is where much of this was recorded, using the Rolling Stones mobile recording truck, which a lot of other bands, I think Led Zeppelin and countless other bands use that truck. I don't know if it's still around, that recording truck in the 70s. So this, like I said, is very, as far as the creation of this album, is very disjointed and chaotic because people were coming and going, a lot of hangers-on. The Rolling Stones were basically living this life of decadence like Roman emperors at the time. Sometimes certain members of the band would be there, sometimes they wouldn't. They would sort of show up when they felt like it. They would record late into the night and just sort of all hours. There was no real rhyme or reason or schedule to the recording and the creation of this album. A lot of other people, Graham Parsons and just a ton of other friends and hangers-on were there. Eventually Keith sort of put his foot down and chased a bunch of them out so that they could get some things done, apparently. Also on this album, you had quite a few people: Keith, naturally, Mick Taylor, producer Jimmy Miller, some of the others that were heavy into the drug use. And then you had the other camp of people like Jagger and some of the others that were no angels when it came to drugs and that, but they weren't as heavy in there, so that caused some friction. Mick had just married Bianca around this time, so he was sort of caught up in that and wasn't around all the time. Charlie and Bill kind of came and went. Mick Taylor kind of came and went. Some of these songs may only have one or two members of the Rolling Stones on there. There's some controversy on Bill Wyman's side because it's said that he only plays bass on 7 or 8 of the tracks. He disputes that and says that he plays bass on more, not all the tracks, but more than that, and that Mick or Keith or whoever got the credits wrong. But in some cases, Keith or Mick Taylor plays bass on some of the songs. So just a lot of craziness going on at this point in the Rolling Stones' life. And so out of all this upheaval and confusion, they somehow managed to pull together and make one of the best albums of their career. Now, like I said, a lot of this stuff was recorded in England back in the late 60s, early 70s. A lot of these songs were written and recorded, and by written, sometimes they would just be sitting around, whoever happened to be present at the time, jamming and hanging out and just playing some music, and those jams would inevitably at times turn into a real song. Some songs were actually written in France at Nelcote, however you say that. And then at some point, Jagger took all that stuff and went to Los Angeles for mixing and for overdubs, and brought in Billy Preston and some other people, and for some backing vocals and some extra instrumentation. And so just a big mess of an album in creation, at least it was. But it's also, when this came out, went #1, of course, but the reviews were mixed. Some people thought it was great. Some reviews were that it's sort of a muddle and a mess with some bright moments. In subsequent years, probably because the Stones albums subsequent to this were, they never, in my opinion, reached this peak again, even though they made some really good albums. But anyway, in subsequent years, this has become deemed to be their masterpiece, or one of their masterpieces, and one of their best, if not their best album in many people's opinion. I know Rolling Stone, which is a piece of crap, but seems like every time the Rolling Stones release a new album and they review it, they always say it's their best album since Exile. They say that so much that it's sort of a running joke. And a lot of fans, this is love the album. A lot of them really didn't. It's a very murky, soupy, dark, vocals mixed way down in certain cases, and almost indecipherable, or sometimes totally indecipherable if you don't have a lyric sheet, which this doesn't. The music, just sort of jammed together everything at breakneck speed, or just a big mush. Just a big, like I said, just a big murky stew of rock, blues, country, gospel, a lot of distortion, a lot of buried lyrics, and a lot of bright moments. And some people not crazy about that. Others, myself included, see that as sort of the magic of the album, the charm of the album. I think it works out great. This is an album that sort of defies analysis on a song-by-song basis, which I'm going to do that anyway. But it's an album I've found, there's a few albums like that, but this is one of those albums where it's best, if you're going to play it, to just start at the beginning and play the whole thing and go all the way to the end, instead of cherry picking certain songs. There are standout songs. There were singles and at least one hit and another semi-hit from this album. Some others that I think should have been or could have been hits if they'd have been released as singles. But mainly this is just a big blob of an album that's best enjoyed as a whole. And I think Sandinista by The Clash is another album that really works that way. It works best if you just play the whole thing and get into the groove and get into the whole overall mood and sort of tenor of the album, as opposed to trying to pick out individual songs, which with other albums is easier to do. There's sort of a weariness. I love this album on one hand. On the other hand, it's always, and this is my copy that I got. This is the original copy that I've had forever. I got this probably about the time I was in 8th or 9th grade. So back around 78, 79. And look at the cover and all here in a minute. But love the album, but it is kind of a mess of a thing. And there's some hope here, but there's an overall feeling of weariness and sadness and a little bit depressing. So something about the album always put me off a little bit, but at the same time I love the thing. So it's a contradiction of ball of contradictions, ball of confusion, as the Temptations say, I guess. There was some legal wrangling, controversy problems with their ex-manager Alan Klein, and he was a total piece of work, that guy. But he claimed ownership on this and on Sticky Fingers before it on several of the songs, because they had been created while he was still their manager. So he got not exactly sure ownership, copyright, whatever he got. Kind of screwed the band around, basically, like he screwed everyone that he was involved with around. And so that's why the previous albums are all Alan B. Klein Company releases. Going forward, that wouldn't be the case. But Klein kind of gave him a final screwing there, and they probably wish they had never gotten involved with the guy. But yeah, there's a bit of the feeling at this point that the Rolling Stones have gained the world but lost their souls to some degree. I guess it's not the happiest of albums, but in some ways it's a hopeful album despite all that. And yeah, so I guess the cover real quick, you got here, famous cover, probably all know that, but you got the circus sideshow freaks. I always like this guy with the tennis balls or pool balls or whatever that is in his mouth, kind of funny. And on the back you got pictures of the band, and in the insert you got the same thing. Here's the inner sleeves, got the songs listed and more pictures of the band. And this really is one of the great double albums of all time, in my opinion. I'd rank the White Album ahead of this, and I'd probably rank London Calling ahead, but this is up there in the top 3 or 4 best double albums of all time. And so yeah, what else? Let's get into the track listing here. Album opens with Rocks Off. Should have been a single, I think. It's one of their best album openers, and it would definitely be in my top 10, if not my top 5 Rolling Stone songs of all time. I just love the guitar intro, the Oh Yeah by Jagger, which I can't do. Your mouth don't move, but I can hear you speak. It's just a bluesy, hypnotic dirge of sort of confusion, depression, and just the pressures of modern life and and diminished expectations. But it's also rocks like a bastard. It's just a great, just one of their best rockers, one of their best songs overall. Rocks Off gets a 10. Then we go to Rip This Joint, second song, which is a fast-paced rockabilly number. It's almost a punk rock. You could probably some of the punk rockers from 5-6 years later were taking note here. Jagger's screaming and it chugs along. It's not kind of a filler song, but it's a fun filler song, and Rip This Joint gets a 7 from me. Now we get one of the 2 cover songs on this album. Hip Shake, which is a Slim Harpo song from 1966. Blues rockabilly with a little bit of a Bo Diddley beat to it. It's not too far off from Harpo's version, and they do a good job of it. It's a nice little shimmy and boogie blues thing, and I'm going to give that an 8. So good cover there. Stones always were good on covers, and I was just watching Jeff's review of not Undercover of the Night, but I think Undercover of the Night, and he was talking about how the Stones were really good with their cover versions, and compared to a lot of the other 60s bands in their early days. When the Stones did blues early on, they really did it well, and no exception here with their blues covers. So anyway, Hip Shake, good one, gets an 8. Casino Boogie is another kind of a filler song, but it's a nice bluesy number. Bobby Keys on sax does a really good job there. It's kind of the highlight of the song. There's not too much to the song, but I'm going to give that a 7, Casino Blues. Side 1 ends and things pick up noticeably with the hit single, Tumbling Dice. It's just it's kind of blues and rock at the same time. Got this sort of strange time arrangement, but it's very catches your attention and intoxicating. It's just a great groove to it. It's got great backing vocals by the female singers. Great vocal by Mick. Again, I'd said on my Sticky Fingers review, some of Mick's best vocals on that album carries over here. There's some really good Mick vocal highlights on this album. And Tumbling Dice, another favorite Stones song of mine. It's just a classic. It's a 10 all the way. So Linda Ronstadt did a cover of it, which is not as good as the Stones, but it's kind of a fun version. It's a good version, and Linda's a lot more fun to look at than Mick or Keith, that's for sure. She's a whole lot of fun to look at, as a matter of fact. But anyway, Stones version, Tumbling Dice, one of their best songs. It's a solid 10, a stone cold classic, as they say. Side 2 opens with Sweet Virginia, one of the, and there's several country-ish songs on here, but one of the Stones' forays into the country field. And a lot of times when they do the country music, Mick kind of, some of them are great, but Mick kind of hams it up and clowns around. Here he does it pretty straightforward and doesn't goof off, and it's a plus because of that. And so this is a good sort of a old-timey country song, Sweet Virginia, longing song, and it gets a 10 also. Torn and Frayed is the second song on side 2. It's an acoustic sounding country soul sort of vibe to it. Graham Parsons, like I say, was hanging around during these sessions, and his influences shows up throughout the album, and no more so than here. This is one of the most Graham feeling moments on the album, that is to say, sort of about life on the road, and the band is torn and frayed and just sort of worn out, kind of hobos wandering around America feel to it. Torn and Frayed is a great one, that gets a 10 as well. Third song, Sweet Black Angel, which is one of the Stones' few ventures into being overtly political. It's about Angela Davis. Interesting side note is they only played that song live once, and they played it during their 72 tour in their stop in Fort Worth, my hometown. So that's kind of a neat deal. So this is about Angela Davis, but even if you don't know that it's about Angela Davis or who she is, a young Stones fan just getting into the band now that has no idea or doesn't care who Angela Davis is, it really wouldn't make any difference. It's still a beautiful, affecting sound. It's sort of an old field recording, Appalachian mountain music sounding thing, and just a beautiful song that gets a 10. Side 2 concludes with Loving Cup, and just another, you got Nicky Hopkins piano, Mick Taylor guitar, you got the horns, Jagger's great vocals, and they all just blend together and work together just perfectly. It's sort of Jagger asking, maybe demanding love from his partner, girlfriend, whoever he's singing to. And another one of the highlights of the album. It gets a 10, and that highlight feel continues as we go to side 3, which opens with Happy, probably Keith Richards' best song. It would come down to me between that and Before They Make Me Run on Some Girls. But like I've said before, I always like when Keith gets a song to sing, and they're almost always a treat. And Happy is just a great, just the frustrations of life and trying to just chug through life and make the best of things. But a great vocal by Keith. And this is one of those where you've got, other than Keith, you've got Jimmy Miller, Bobby Keys, Jim Price, and Nicky Hopkins. So no other Stones. Mick would later come in and mix in some background vocals singing there. But this was one of those where they showed up. Keith showed up that day to the studio, and none of the other Stones were there, but Price and Keys and Hopkins were, and they just sort of goofing around and jamming and playing, and they came up with this riff and said, hey, that sounds good. And one of the I think Keith's quote is that at noon this song didn't exist. By 4 o'clock we had it recorded. So one of his best vocals, which, you know, Keith's not known for his, not exactly Otis Redding or anything, but he has really great affecting vocals, I will say that. And this is one of his best and one of his best songs. And it's almost impossible to listen to this song and not be happy. So Happy gets a 10. Now we get the very politely titled Turd on the Run. It's a boogie blues thing with screamy Jagger vocals and great harmonica. It's a silly title, but a fun song. It's filler, but again, it's pretty good filler, and it gets a 7.8 in my rating. Then we go third song, Ventilator Blues. This is got some good slide guitar by Mick Taylor. Jagger trying to pretend like he's Muddy Waters or Howlin' Wolf, trying to be the badass blues man, which is kind of funny when you think of Jagger, but he almost pulls it off, and it's got this really herky-jerky rhythm to it. It's a great little song. This is sort of the blues band that somebody like the White Stripes only wish they could be, and then the Rolling Stones just pull it off so effortlessly. And not that I'm saying the White Stripes don't have their share of some good songs, but they could have never done this. Eric Clapton could have never done this for all his love of blues, but the Stones just pull it off so effortlessly. Things like this, Ventilator Blues, and I think this is one that Keith's not on, but it gets a 10. The next song, I Just Want to See His Face, is just this super buried vocal, murky, kind of foreboding, chilling, sinister, creepy song. It's got some harks back to Everybody Needs Somebody to Love, which it was a song the Rolling Stones covered back in the early 60s. It's listen to this music, relax your mind. Bobby Whitlock plays the Wurlitzer organ that's so effective in here. It's sort of in some ways reminds me of that Can You Take Me Back bit in the White Album from Paul right before Revolution number 9, which that's just a little snippet. This is a full song. And Whitlock's father was a preacher, which interested Jagger, and he was talking to Whitlock about that. And Whitlock had grown up in the church, and also Jagger wanted to hear some gospel sounding music, and so Bobby Whitlock, went to the organ and started playing some gospel tinged music. Really probably should have got a writing credit for this song because of his input, but just sort of an ethereal, almost impossible to hear the words. You need to Google and look up the lyrics if you want to see what he's talking about. And it's just I don't know, how religious the Jagger ever was, but I mean, it's just sort of sometimes you need, thinking about whether you believe in God or not, or need his help, or just need to see, feel his touch, or something like that. It can be interpreted a lot of ways, I'm sure. But I Just Want to See Your Face is just a very, very otherworldly, very strange, very odd, but also very beautiful song. It gets a 10 in my book. And I think that's the last song on the side there is Let It Loose. Starts with that sort of watery piano playing that I love so much, that shows up on a lot of Stones records throughout the this period and into the 70s. It's a soul blues thing with gospel feel to it again. A lot of gospel feel on this album, throughout this album. It's got this long Hey Jude play out that sort of goes on forever. Feels like it does anyway, but it's okay because it's such a great song. Another great vocal by Jagger. So Let It Loose gets a 10 in my book. And we go on to side 4. Opens with All Down the Line. This is just your good old stock and trade Rolling Stone riff heavy rocker, sort of the Brown Sugar or the Bitch or the Jumpin' Jack Flash of the album. And so, just your trademark Rolling Stone song. When you think of the Rolling Stone sound, this is one that would come to mind. So it's one of those that, has been played to death on the radio too, but it's a great song. I'm going to give it a 9. I think compared to some of the other trademark Rolling Stone rockers, it's almost right there, but not quite as good as some of the others. But can't complain about it too much. It's just got a lot of great guitar, horns, and this whole album is just so rich in organ and horns and guitars and great vocals that harmonica shows up all throughout the album. But All Down the Line was one that a lot of people probably rated 10. I'm going to give it a 9. Stop Breaking Down is the second cover on the album. This is an old Robert Johnson song from 1937. It's got some good slide guitar. I think Mick Taylor plays that. Harmonica, courtesy of Mick Jagger. Not as good as the Robert Johnson version. I mean, Mick can't match Robert Johnson vocally, but is still pretty good. I'm going to give it a 7. It's, I don't know, it's alright. They were also involved in a lawsuit in 2000 because I think they tried to claim credit to this song and to Love in Vain, another Robert Johnson song, on Let It Bleed originally, but courts ruled that they were not in public domain and that they were still under copyright, and so the credits and the money had to go to Johnson's family. So that's a good thing for not Robert Johnson, he's dead, but it's a good thing for his descendants. But yeah, 7 on Stop Breaking Down. It's a good version. The Johnson version, the original, is better. But things go back up. Shine a Light. This was actually a song that dates back to like 1969 when Brian Jones was still around, and even though it's credited to Jagger Richards, I don't think even plays on it, and he didn't really have anything to do with the writing of it. This was a Mick Jagger and Leon Russell written thing in reality, and it was originally called Got a Line on You. And the thought is that it's even though the lyrics were changed up a little bit later by Jagger, but the thought is that it's sort of a song about Brian Jones because he was descending into drug addiction and, being more and more disassociated from the band and everything, and just sort of the sad fate of Brian Jones. But Leon Russell recorded a version of this, and it was supposed to be on one of his albums that came out in 1970. It ended up not coming out till it's like the 90s or something, when it came out as a bonus track to that album when it was re-released. But then Jagger reworked it a little bit, and you get the Stones version. Billy Preston, great on here. Bass guitar might be played by Mick Taylor, it might be played by Bill Wyman. They give conflicting stories on who plays the bass there. Great vocals by Jagger, and just a great song. So Shine a Light gets a 10. Soul Survivor ends the album. It's a nice rocker, again with gospel overtones, and not a whole lot to it, but it's a tasty, nice little soul gospel rocker to end the album on. Not one of the best on the album, but still good enough to get a 9. So it's a pretty good song. And overall, I'm going to give this album a 9.6. It's a classic. Like the Beatles' White Album, some people would argue maybe this should have been a single album. I could see where you could take some of the cherry pick, some of the absolute gems, and make just a killer of a single album. But like the White Album, it's also hard, even though there is some filler, it's also hard to determine what would be best taken off this album. So, because even the filler works, it all adds, it all blends together. It's like everything in the kitchen sink thrown in here, but it all complements each other in the end. And I don't think you would have quite the mystique and the magic that this album has as a double album if you were to cut it down to a single album. So, what'd I say, 9.6. And like I said, we're going to get to the rest of the most of the rest of the Rolling Stones albums. I think this is when Brian left the band, things were never the same, but I think this kind of marks because they still had that carryover magic through Sticky Fingers. We'll Let It Bleed, because Brian's barely on that, through that, Sticky Fingers, and this one. And I think this sort of closes a chapter on the original incarnation of the Rolling Stones, and they would be quite a different band from here on out, which doesn't mean they would be no good, because they came up with some good and some even great moments, but I don't think they ever matched their 60s output or these two albums from the 70s again. But I do think there's some really good stuff and greatness still to be had, so we'll get to that as we get on to the albums up ahead. But yeah, Exile on Main Street, it's a classic. It's not much to say about it, even though I've rambled on for half an hour about it, but it's essential. If you like rock and roll, if you like soul, blues, even gospel, you really need this in your collection. So hope everybody has a good weekend, and we will be back soon with Goat's Head Soup.